By nightfall on December 8, the journalist David Brinkley wrote of Washington, "The markets looked as if a high wind had blown them clean. There were 250,000 government workers in Washington, D.C., up from 38,000 in 1917. That number would more than double during the war." Secretary of War Henry Stimson ordered the entire U.S. Army into uniform, numbering about 1.6 million men. The Navy quickly decided to reinforce Pearl Harbor and set up a new aerial search pattern to guard against a renewed air raid. In cities throughout the country, police were placed on 24-hour duty, guarding defense plants and bridges and water supply facilities against sabotage. Ports throughout the country were closed to all foreign shipping. All weather reports by radio broadcast were halted, as they might prove useful to the enemy in choosing air raid targets. A nationwide strike of 125,000 welders was summarily called off by the Union leaders, who cited the situation in the Pacific. Looking back from the present, it is practically impossible to reconstruct the terror of those early days of the war, when it was not at all obvious that the American mainland would be spared enemy air raids. On Monday, the radio waves and newspapers were full of reports of air raids over American cities. Associated Press tickers reported an unknown plane off Montauk Point, Long Island, and air raid sirens wailed in the streets of Manhattan. The Brooklyn Eagle reported enemy planes were approaching Long Island from New England and then from the Virginia coast. Bombers, apparently, were heading for the Brooklyn Navy Yard, for Mitchell Field and other points. Air raid sirens are sounded. Schools were closed. Employees were sent home. Police warned pedestrians to keep off the crowded streets. On the West Coast, men armed with shotguns and hunting rifles piled into cars and drove toward the beaches, eager to do battle with the Japanese landing forces. In San Francisco, the switches were pulled on street and bridge lights, but otherwise the city's hills glittered almost as brightly as they had on December 6. Air raid sirens blared throughout the night, and were repeated by ferry horns eventually. It seemed the ferry horns were leading and the air raid sirens answering. Vigilantes took baseball bats to automobile headlights, and threatened to smash the windows of merchants and homeowners who did not observe the blackout order. Numerous reports had Japanese planes patrolling about 100 miles off the coast, and on Monday night it was confidently reported by the Army Air Forces that 60 Japanese planes had appeared over the Golden Gate Bridge, and were beaten off by American fighters. Asked how he knew the planes were Japanese, General William Ryan replied, "Well, they were not Army planes, they were not Navy planes, and you can be sure they were not civilian planes." When, on Tuesday, there were suggestions that there had been no Japanese planes over the bay, Lieutenant General John DeWitt replied angrily, "Death and destruction is likely to come to this city at any moment. The people of San Francisco seem unable to appreciate that we are at war in every sense. Those planes were over our community for a definite period. They were enemy planes. I mean Japanese planes. They were tracked out at sea. Why bombs were not dropped I do not know. The general might have stopped there, but apparently could not help himself. It might have been better if some bombs were dropped to awaken this city. We will never have a practice alert. We will never call an alert unless we believe an attack to be imminent. If I cannot knock these facts into your heads with words, I will turn you over to the police and let them knock them into you with clubs." Americans depended on radio and newspapers to keep them informed, but both were full of wild rumors. Military and civil officials were quoted faithfully and respectfully, but it was apparent that the confusion, fear, and disorientation went to the top. The quick clampdown of military censors in Hawaii only amplified the rumor-mongering. The Japanese had control of the Pacific. California was indefensible. The army was preparing to meet the invader in the Rocky Mountains or perhaps on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River. Admiral Stark, chief of naval operations, briefed congressional leaders at the Navy Department on Tuesday, December 9. The briefing was strictly classified, but reporters waiting on Constitution Avenue needed only to study the dark expressions on the faces of the emerging congressmen to deduce that the news was very bad. "The atmosphere in the Capitol was on the narrow edge of hysteria," wrote the journalist Marquis Childs. "The crippling losses suffered at Pearl Harbor were the worst kept secret in town. Each senator by nightfall had told 10 other persons and they had told 10 others, the story losing nothing in the telling. Partisan politics were, for the moment, deeply out of favor and congressional leaders of both parties avowed unity in the face of the emergency. For the Navy this development was a mixed blessing. however, as the unanimous rage of Democrats and Republicans was unleashed against the culprits who had allowed the cherished battleships, built over many years with elephantine budget appropriations, to be blindsided in the heart of the nation's great Pacific stronghold. Who was to blame for the travesty? On Monday, Democratic Congressman John Dingell of Michigan called for an investigation, suggesting that the Navy must have been grossly incompetent. The demand for answers was echoed angrily in the press, and on Tuesday, Congress announced a formal inquiry. Heads were obviously going to roll, and by Wednesday it seemed that one of those heads might belong to Navy Secretary Frank Knox. With timing that could not have been any worse, in the week immediately before the war, Knox had launched a media offensive to reassure the country that the Navy had nothing to fear from the Japanese. He had been interviewed by Collier's magazine, a week before Pearl Harbor, in an article lamentably titled "The Navy is Ready." If it came to war, he had predicted, the Navy would need no more than 6 months to knock Japan out of the water. Secretary Knox had granted another interview to the American magazine, whose January issue landed on newsstands the same day Japanese bombs landed on Battleship Row. The day after the attack, the story was still being advertised in newspapers across the country, equipped with amazing, new, secret, deadly devices that no enemy will ever know about. The biggest, toughest, hardest-hitting, straightest shooting Navy in the world is primed and ready to write finis to aggressors. Let 'em come from both sides. If they want to, we can win on 2 oceans, says Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, in the January American magazine now out. The humiliated secretary shrewdly made himself absent from Washington in the first week of the war, flying to Pearl Harbor to assess the catastrophe in person. Aiming to soothe the collective hysteria that seemed to have possessed the country, the White House announced that Roosevelt would address the American people by radio in his 20th fireside chat. Presidential speechwriters Bob Sherwood and Sam Rosenman had been hard at it since Sunday evening, and they tinkered with new drafts until minutes before the broadcast at 10 o'clock Tuesday night. More than 60 million Americans would tune in, repeating the size of the previous day's radio audience for the infamy speech to Congress. The president was an acknowledged master of radio, having used the medium since the 1920s to advance his career, enact his agenda, and hammer down his opponents. His sonorous, lilting voice carried well over the airwaves. He had a thespian's natural feeling for cadence, pace, and emphasis. Above all, he employed a deft common touch that belied his sheltered upbringing as a scion of the Hudson Valley gentry. He did not try to disguise the aristocratic inflections in his voice, knowing perhaps that the attempt would expose him as a fraud, but he managed to be warm and plainspoken without sounding patronizing or insincere, and he used a laid-back, conversational tone that created, in the listener's mind, an uncanny intimacy. It is often said that Americans liked Roosevelt because they felt they knew him as a neighbor or a friend. That was especially true of Americans middle-aged or older, for whom broadcasting was still a novelty. Never having heard radio until reaching adulthood, they were less inclined to take it for granted than were their children, who had listened to it all their lives. When the president came over the airwaves, they were more susceptible to the unconscious illusion that he was really there, that his presence, and not just his voice, had come into their living rooms, that he was not just speaking but in a sense conversing with them. Tuesday night's broadcast was made from a large room on the first floor of the White House. Radio engineers set up their microphones on a wooden desk, on which also sat a reading lamp, an ashtray, a pitcher of water, and a glass. 50 or 60 people sat in rows on wooden folding chairs. At about 10 minutes before 10, the president was wheeled into the room and behind the desk. He opened his loose-leaf notebook and shuffled through the pages of the speech. He smoked a cigarette. He stubbed it out. At 10 o'clock, the radio announcers each spoke into their microphones, introducing the president. He began, "My fellow Americans." It was about as angry a speech as Roosevelt ever delivered, a hard-hitting philippic against the Japanese militarist regime, whose sudden criminal attacks, he said, provide the climax of a decade of international immorality. He returned again and again to the theme that Japan and its Axis accomplices were a league of thugs who had to be stopped by the decent and law-abiding nations of the world. Powerful and resourceful gangsters have banded together to make war upon the whole human race. We must be set to face a long war against crafty and powerful bandits. There is no such thing as security for any nation or any individual in a world ruled by the principles of gangsterism. He defined the war as a defense of our right to live among our world neighbors in freedom, in common decency, without fear of assault. There should be a massive increase in war production, with a 7-day week in all war industries, to support not only American military forces but also those of America's allies. Acknowledging that the American people and the press wanted to know what was happening in the Pacific, he insisted that it was necessary to conceal the full truth from the enemy. As for Pearl Harbor, he admitted the damage was serious but would say no more. Guam, Wake, and Midway were under attack and might fall. The Philippines were taking punishment, but defending themselves vigorously. Wartime secrecy would be a burden for the American people, but he warned them not to believe half the rumors they were hearing. These ugly little hints of complete disaster fly thick and fast in wartime, and asked the press to exercise restraint in printing unconfirmed reports. He did not deny the success of the Japanese attack. We may acknowledge that our enemies have performed a brilliant feat of deception, perfectly timed and executed with great skill. It was a thoroughly dishonorable deed, but we must face the fact that modern warfare as conducted in the Nazi manner is a dirty business. We don't like it, we did not want to get in it, but we are in it and we were going to fight it with everything we have got. When the president had finished and been wheeled back into the Oval Study, Sam Rosenman went to see him. He found him alone, behind his desk, smoking a cigarette and poring over his beloved stamps. It was a rare man who could deliver such a speech, on the third day of a war that had started so badly, and then head back to his office to tinker with his stamp collection. He was serene, apparently content, clearing his mind of the day's work so that he could sleep soundly and awake the next day fresh. He knew by this time all the damage that had been done to us at Pearl Harbor, Rosenman wrote. Yet I felt, as I looked at him, that he was confident that ultimate victory, as he had said, was certain. To critics howling for the heads of the men responsible for Pearl Harbor, FDR had offered an oblique reply. There is no such thing as impregnable defense against powerful aggressors who sneak up in the dark and strike without warning. The same could not be said for Allied commanders in positions west of Hawaii, who failed to put up any meaningful resistance to enemy planes that struck later the same day. Beginning just hours after the raid on Pearl Harbor, as dawn broke over the western Pacific, land-based bombers and fighters of the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a tightly choreographed aerial blitzkrieg against American and British bases throughout the region, and by the third day of the war the local Allied air forces had been reduced to mincemeat. That was a defeat more ruinous in its consequences than the raid on Pearl Harbor, because it led directly to the fall of the Philippines and Malaya. It also gave the lie to the theory, bandied around by those unwilling to admit they had underestimated Japan, that Pearl Harbor had been a lucky sucker punch that could never be repeated. At dawn on December 7, medium G-3M and G-4M bombers, accompanied by Japan's sleek single-seat fighter plane, the A-6M-0, lifted off from airfields on the island of Formosa and set out across the China Sea to pulverize American airbases in the Philippines. Others took off from newly constructed airfields in Indochina to strike British airbases in Malaya, Burma, and Hong Kong. Still more roared north from the remote atolls of the Marshall Islands to attack Wake Island. A small carrier task force, built around the Ryujo, sailed from Palau to launch strikes on Legazpi, on the southern coast of the Philippine island of Luzon, and then turned south to pummel the U.S. Naval Base of Davao, on the island of Mindanao. General Douglas A. MacArthur, the U.S. Far East commander, had received several hours' warning of the raid at Pearl Harbor, but his Manila headquarters was thrown into a state of dazed confusion in the first hours of the war, ensuring that the initial Japanese air raids scored with overwhelming success. Much of the blame would later be fixed on General Richard K. Sutherland, MacArthur's chief of staff, who seemed determined to keep subordinate officers away from his boss. The upshot was that American air forces were effectively paralyzed for lack of orders. At midday, Japanese bombers appeared suddenly over Clark Field, the principal American air base in the Philippines, located about 40 miles northwest of Manila, and dropped their sticks of bombs from 18,000 feet. From the ground, these appeared as columns of evenly spaced silver glints falling diagonally behind the planes. They grew steadily larger, and Americans on the ground dove for foxholes. A procession of cataclysmic explosions fell across the heart of the airbase, among the hangars and maintenance shops and parked planes. Every bomb released fell within the base, and not one structure in the vicinity was left unscathed. An American pilot looking down at the scene could not even see the airstrip, because the whole area was boiling with smoke, dust and flames. In the middle was a huge column of greasy black smoke from the top of which ugly red flames billowed intermittently. No sooner had the bombers passed over than the Zeros roared in at rooftop altitude, locked in compact three-plane formations, and strafed the parked planes that had not been finished off by the bombs. None of the American planes caught on the ground at Clark that day would ever fly again. By the end of that first day of the war, half the air power defending the Philippines was gone. 12 B-17s and 30 P-40s were totally destroyed. 5 more B-17s were damaged. That initial disaster guaranteed that more would follow, as the Americans had lost the ability to mount counterstrikes on Japanese air bases or to put up any effective fighter resistance to the wave of air raids that would inevitably follow. The truth about MacArthur's weird malfunctioning on that day remains shrouded in mystery even now. It is possible he was unwilling to order a strike on Japanese bases from Philippine territory, hoping that the Japanese offensive might otherwise spare the islands. Not only would the general escape scrutiny and censure for his inexplicable failures, no less ignominious and more avoidable than those at Pearl Harbor, but he would be adopted by the American people as a much-loved war hero, the preeminent Allied celebrity of the Pacific War. In Malaya, the British air defenses fared no better. RAF fighters engaged enemy bombers and Zeros in a pitched air battle over Kota Baru on the northeast coast, where a Japanese invasion force was put ashore on the first morning of the war. The result was a lopsided victory for the Japanese, as several Royal Air Force Bristol Blenheim and Lockheed Hudson bombers went down in flames. Meanwhile, Japanese G-3M bombers from bases in Indochina, more than 600 miles away, appeared suddenly in the skies over Singapore and dropped sticks of bombs on RAF runways and base installations. The raid came as a bolt out of the blue, for the British had never imagined that the Japanese were capable of mounting airstrikes across such great distances. And RAF aerodrome at Kota Baru was abandoned in a state approaching panic, with men lighting out for the hills, ignoring the threats and imprecations of their officers, and allowing food, fuel, weaponry, and the best airstrip in northern Malaya to fall into the hands of the enemy. British air defense plans had placed too much faith in the Brewster Buffalo, an obsolete fighter purchased from the United States. A pilot who detested the aircraft said it looked a lot like the racing planes of the 1930s, all-engine, a barrel fuselage, stubby wings, a large canopy, and almost no tail. The underpowered Buffalo suffered fuel delivery problems that limited its rate of climb. It had a flawed landing gear, which often caused serious damage on landing, and its .50 caliber guns were prone to jamming, particularly in the humid weather of the tropics. In both the Philippines and Malaya, the sudden onslaught pushed the Allied air forces into combat conditions for which they were not adequately prepared, multiplying their non-combat losses. Dozens of American and British aircraft crashed due to engine failures, accidents, or mid-air collisions with other planes in their squadrons. Planes were shot down by friendly anti-aircraft fire when attempting to return to base. Planes were forced to ditch when they ran out of fuel. Planes managed to land safely but had to be scrapped because of heavy damage. To the Japanese, a crashed Allied airplane was as good as one shot down, perhaps even a little better, since it involved no expenditure of ammunition. If the aircrew went down with it, so much the better. In the years before the war, the Americans and British had taken comfort in a widely held conviction that Japanese airpower was not to be viewed seriously. That impression was nourished by quackish, pseudo-scientific theories proposed by experts of various fields. The Japanese would always make bungling pilots, the authorities patiently explained, because they suffered from innate physiological defects. They were cross-eyed and nearsighted, possibly a symptom of their slanted eyes. As infants, they had been carried on the backs of their mothers, causing their heads to wobble in a way that threw off the balance in the inner ear. Japanese cultural norms emphasized conformity and obedience. Therefore, their young men must lack the aviator's traits of individualism and self-reliance. Western aviation journals cited statistics purporting to show that Japan had the highest aviation crash rate in the world. It was acknowledged that Japan had developed a self-sufficient aircraft manufacturing industry, and that was a surprising achievement, admittedly, but the idea that Japanese-built planes could be any good was simply beneath consideration. Only after the shocking losses of December 1941 did it begin to dawn on the Allies that they had seen only what the Japanese had wanted them to see. If he is arrogant, Sun Tzu had written, behave timidly so as to encourage his arrogance. In fact, The Japanese naval aviators were among the very best pilots in the world. They had been selected in highly competitive recruiting programs, and earned their wings by surviving long, intense training regimens. They were, on average, far more seasoned than their Allied counterparts. Many had flown more than 100 aerial combat missions over China since 1937, accruing an average of 500 to 600 flight hours in the cockpit. They were intensely motivated and eager to correct all the misimpressions that the West had held of them. They showed resourcefulness and adaptability. They worked supremely well together, and they were ruthless in attacking any weaknesses. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was a dogfighting champion, an aerial acrobat that outturned, outclimbed, and outmaneuvered any fighter plane the Allies could send against it. It was armed with two 7.7mm machine guns and two powerful wing-mounted 20mm cannons licensed from the Swiss arms manufacturer Oerlikon. It excelled in relatively low speed, low-altitude tail chasing, because its tight turning radius allowed it to get behind any Allied fighter plane or even to flip over on its back and kill the enemy with a short, accurate burst from above. The Japanese pilot spoke reverently of the airplane's responsiveness to the slightest pressure on the controls. "She handled like a dream," said fighter pilot Saburo Sakai, who flew in the first attack runs against the Philippines. "Just a flick of the wrist, she was gone. I went through all sorts of aerobatics, standing the Zero on her tail, diving, sliding off on the wings." Allied pilots who attacked the Zero using classical dogfighting techniques, chasing and maneuvering to get on the enemy's tail, were shot down almost to a man. Those lucky enough to escape into a cloud, or parachute to the ground, were full of horrified expletives at the shocking capabilities of this mysterious fighter. The Zero had been placed in service in the summer of 1940, almost 18 months before Pearl Harbor. Operating from bases on Formosa and along the Chinese coast, Zeros had accompanied bombers on long-range missions into the heart of China. By the standards of the era, the aircraft's range was extraordinary. Manipulating fuel mixtures and propeller speeds, the Japanese had shown it was possible to fly this single-seat plane more than 1,000 miles on a single tank. Pilots were accustomed to the taxing work of such long missions, sometimes even setting the trim to level flight and dozing off in the cockpit. The Zero had chewed up Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese Nationalist Air Force in 1940 and 1941. Not a single Zero was downed in air-to-air combat over China. The arrival of this deadly plane had not escaped the attention of General Claire Lee Chennault, commander of the Flying Tigers, an American volunteer group that fought for the Chinese Air Force. One of the Tigers, in his diary entry for November 21, 1941, noted that General Chennault had coached the P-40 pilots on how to fight the Zero, offering the same tactical advice that Navy fighter jocks would later develop: independently dive from altitude, stick to your wingman, set up passing shots, and never try to dogfight a Zero, particularly in turning combat. Hit and run, dive, and then come back to altitude. Of course, always try to stay in groups of at least two. As soon as you find yourself alone, search the skies to rejoin someone. But Chennault's intelligence reports were simply ignored in Washington. The Americans could not bring themselves to believe that Japan could have built and manufactured a machine with a climb rate of 3,000 feet per minute. For a year and a half, the Zero remained almost completely unknown in Allied aviation circles, and the American and British pilots were forced to learn about this lethal athlete the hard way. It was yet another example of the fatal hubris of the West in the face of plentiful evidence of the Japanese threat, an attitude that would cost hundreds of planes and aircrews in the early months of the Pacific War. On Wednesday, December 10, an armada of more than 50 Japanese bombers crossed the China Sea and cruised serenely over Manila Bay at an altitude of 20,000 feet. Nothing could be done to stop them. A few P-40s had tried to intercept them off the coast of northern Luzon, but had been brushed aside by the escorting Zeros, and the U.S. Navy's 3-inch anti-aircraft guns could not even reach that height. Untroubled by resistance or opposition, the bombers circled the target-rich panorama below, like a flock of well-disciplined buzzards, as one witness recalled. They were obviously drawing a bead on the Manila waterfront, the ships moored at the wharves, and the U.S. naval base at Cavite, the Navy's principal base west of Pearl Harbor. When they finally let go of their payloads, the bombs cut a swath of carnage through the heart of Cavite, wiping out the repair shops, the warehouses, the machine shops, the barracks, and the power plant. Several barges and tugboats were destroyed at their berths, and one submarine, the Sea Lion, was a total loss. Fires raged out of control. Strong winds swept off the bay and fed the flames, and the firefighters could do little to stop them because much of their equipment had been destroyed. Lieutenant John Buckley, a PT boat skipper, was appalled at the sight. "They would flatten it," he said of Cavite. "There is not any other word." Here was the only American naval base in the Orient beyond Pearl Harbor pounded into bloody rubbish. Admiral Thomas C. Hart, Commander-in-Chief of the Asiatic Fleet, watched the scene from the roof of his fleet headquarters building. His reaction is unrecorded. He might have had some premonition that the Army's air defenses would not stand, because he had taken the wise precaution of sending most of his ships away to the south before the outbreak of the war. Now his main base, with all its supporting facilities and munitions, was a smoking hole in the ground. Most damaging, perhaps, was the loss of 230 torpedoes. At this point it was Hart's awful duty to abandon the Philippines, to send all remaining ships of the U.S. Asiatic Fleet south, where they might join up with British and Dutch units for the defense of the Dutch East Indies. A week before the war, against the recommendation of his admirals, Prime Minister Churchill had ordered a powerful naval squadron to Singapore in hopes of deterring Japanese aggression against the colony. Force C, as it was called, was built around two of Britain's finest and most prestigious ships of war, the battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse. The fate of those ships, even more than the loss of the American battle line at Pearl Harbor, was to mark the turning of a new page in naval history. On December 8, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Tom Phillips had ordered his force to sea to intercept and destroy a Japanese invasion force sighted in the South China Sea. The British had no aircraft carrier in the theater, and the RAF was already in disarray, so the squadron was obliged to sail without air support. Phillips recognized the danger but hoped that the operation could finish quickly and so get away to the eastward before the Japanese can mass a formidable scale of attack against us. From the first, Force C had a great deal of difficulty in even locating the Japanese fleet. They headed northwest into the Gulf of Siam, toward the Japanese beachhead at Kota Baru in northern Malaya, then chased a false report of a Japanese landing at Kuantan, farther down the coast. Despite the lack of air cover, the officers and crews of the great British warships were upbeat whatever they had heard of the shocking result of the air battles over northern Malaya. They remained confident that the Japanese were no match for two of the best and most powerful ships of the Royal Navy. Bert Wynne, able seaman of Repulse, recalled that among his mates the main topic of conversation was how long would it take us to sink the Japanese warships felt to be in attendance around the coast of Singora. I still remember the feeling of absolute confidence running throughout the ship. The outcome of such an engagement was felt to be a formality. When, on the afternoon of December 9, a Japanese surface force was sighted by a British patrol plane, a flag deck officer of the Repulse remarked to CBS radio correspondent Cecil Brown about. That night over dinner in the officer's wardroom, Brown raised a provocative question. In light of what had happened at Pearl Harbor, were the British too confident? The British officers chewed the question over thoughtfully, and one conceded that it was wrong to underestimate the enemy. But the prevailing feeling among them was summed up in another officer's reply: "We are not overconfident, we just don't think the enemy is much good. They could not beat China for 5 years and now look what they are doing out here. Jumping all over the map instead of meeting at 1 or 2 places. They cannot be very smart to be doing that." The air attack on Force C began shortly after 11 a.m. On Wednesday, December 10, it was pressed home by 3 waves of twin-engine G-3M Nell and G-4M Betty bombers of the 22nd Air Flotilla, based in Indochina, near Saigon. The attackers had crossed the South China Sea, had been in the air for about 5 hours, and were nearing the point of no return. British lookouts spotted a cluster of ominous black dots high above the horizon in the west, and the Marine buglers sounded the call to quarters. As the incoming G-3 megaseconds came into range, at an altitude of about 12,000 feet, the gunners opened up and the sky was peppered with black anti-aircraft bursts. Remaining in close formation, the bombers dropped several 250-kilogram bombs. Turning and twisting violently, heeling sharply to starboard and then to port, the Repulse dodged all but one bomb, which struck her seaplane deck, killing perhaps 24 men, but otherwise not impairing the maneuverability or defenses of the ship. About 20 minutes later, Force Z radar sets picked up a flight of 9 torpedo-armed G3 megaseconds coming in from the west. They approached virtually on the wavetops and pressed home their attack against the flagship Prince of Wales, diving in groups of 2 and 3 to less than 100 feet altitude and attacking on both bows. She was hit twice near the stern, jamming her rudder and flooding her engine rooms. The crippled Leviathan steamed helplessly in a jagged circle, flames and smoke spewing behind her into the sky. A third attack, by torpedo-armed G4 megaseconds of the Kanoya Air Group, descended on the Repulse. Spared in the first barrage, the Repulse maneuvered to save herself, and managed to avoid almost 20 torpedoes, but at last she was caught in an anvil attack, with torpedoes dropped simultaneously on each of her bows. For me, wrote Cecil Brown, who watched from the flag deck and recorded his impressions in a notebook, this whole picture orange flame belching from the 4-inchers, white tracers from pom-poms and Vickers guns, and gray airplanes astonishingly close, like butterflies pinned on blue cardboard, is a confusing, macabre game. Repulse was struck twice and immediately began to take on water. Suddenly there was a massive explosion, one of her crew recalled. I immediately knew we would lost. Repulse, for within seconds she took on a frightening list to port, so rapid no amount of counter-flooding would save her. Her captain ordered abandon ship, shouting, "You have put up a good show, now save yourselves." The men had to jump into the sea, where many drowned and others treaded water for hours, their faces blackened by fuel oil. At 12:23 p.m., Repulse rolled over and sank stern first, her huge hull protruding vertically from the sea, her bow pointed straight up to the sky. Destroyers circled cautiously, picking up survivors. With the Repulse gone, a new wave of Japanese bombers turned to the easier task of putting away the crippled Prince of Wales. At 12:44 p.m., she was struck between the stacks by a 500-kilogram bomb dropped from altitude by a G4M bomber, and began to sink immediately. Many men were trapped below decks when the ship rolled over and began to sink. The destroyers circled and picked up as many swimmers as they could. A Japanese plane overhead flashed a bravura taunt in plain English. "We have finished our task now. You may carry on." A handful of RAF fighter planes arrived just as the Prince of Wales was going down, but they could do nothing but circle and watch. One of the pilots recalled the sight of the men in the water. "Lack of petrol forced me to leave, but during that hour I had seen many men in dire danger waving, cheering and joking, as if they were holidaymakers at Brighton waving at a low-flying aircraft. It shook me, for here was something above human nature." The battle claimed the lives of 47 British officers and 793 men. The Japanese, amazingly, had lost only 3 planes in the action. The attack, the British had to admit, had been carried out in textbook fashion. "The enemy attacks were without doubt magnificently carried out and pressed well home," wrote the captain of the Repulse after the battle. The high-level bombers kept tight formation and appeared not to jink. It had been a finely choreographed 1-2 punch, with the high-level bombers arriving first and distracting the gunners, followed closely by the torpedo bombers that came in low and dropped their deadly fish in perfectly executed anvil attacks. On the morning of December 10, Churchill was awakened by a telephone call from Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, the first Sea Lord, who gave him the appalling news that Japanese bombers had sent both ships to the bottom. "Are you sure it's true?" the Prime Minister asked. "There is no doubt at all," Pound replied. As he put the receiver back in its cradle, Churchill later wrote, "I was glad to be alone. In all the war one never received a more direct shock. As I turned over and twisted in bed the full horror of the news sank in upon me. Over all this vast expanse of waters Japan was supreme, and we everywhere weak and naked. It meant that the last vestige of British sea power in the Pacific had been broken. It meant that even India could now be threatened by sea, as it soon would be. It meant that the Indian Ocean sea lanes were vulnerable. Both ships, but the Prince of Wales especially, had held immense significance to British naval prestige. She was one of the newest and most formidable battleships in the fleet. The previous August, she had carried Churchill to Placentia Bay, Newfoundland, to meet Roosevelt in the flesh for the first time since either man had come to power, and her sweeping teak decks had provided the dramatic setting for that first wartime Anglo-American summit. 3 days earlier, Japanese airplanes had blindsided the American battleships in their anchorage, but never before had such ships been sunk by air attack while operating at sea in full combat readiness. The fate of Force Z was something new in the annals of naval war, and it settled old and bitter arguments. Though it was a Japanese victory and a painful Allied defeat, it was also a conceptual triumph within naval circles all over the world for the cause of aviation, and did more than even Pearl Harbor to undermine the power of the Mahanian Big Gun Club. Fleet doctrine would be hastily rewritten. Battleships would now be relegated to a support role within task forces built around aircraft carriers. Their anti-aircraft weaponry would be doubled, tripled, and finally quadrupled, until they were bristling with guns of every caliber, and better able to defend both themselves and the carriers against enemy air attack. Their huge 14 and 16-inch main batteries would be employed mainly for shore bombardment, in support of amphibious troop landings. These doctrines were swiftly adopted by the U.S. Navy, and to a lesser extent by the Royal Navy, but they would be slower to penetrate the upper ranks of the Imperial Japanese Navy, where hopes for a decisive clash of battleships at sea would be cherished almost to the end of the war. The Japanese offensive advanced southward by a leapfrogging pattern. Land-based Zeros and medium bombers attacked suddenly and across unexpectedly long distances, clearing the skies over the beaches for the invasion forces that followed. Columns of Japanese troopships, unmolested by air attacks, put troops, tanks, and weapons ashore. From those beachheads the Japanese forces advanced inland, swallowing up territory and capturing airfields, usually intact. Air groups flew into the captured airfields and prepared for the next series of attacks further south. New hammer blows then fell on Allied positions with startling rapidity, before the defenders could pull themselves together. The Philippines, Guam, Hong Kong, Malaya all were scenes of Japanese triumph and Allied distress. American and British airfields were strewn with twisted, smoking clots of wreckage, the remains of aircraft wiped out on the ground. Mechanics had been killed, hangars damaged or gutted, spare parts destroyed on the ground or fallen into enemy hands. By Thursday morning, 4 days into the war, Allied pilots and ground support personnel were swimming in a state of confusion, fear, denial, and shock. Scenes of chaotic and panicked retreat added the onus of disgrace to the agony of defeat. At Iba in the Philippines, American personnel fled their posts without orders. At Clark Field, the runways were cratered and unusable, and most of the buildings and hangars had been flattened. The remains of dead airmen were strewn over the base, and would not even be collected and buried until a week had passed. Civilians and military officials, shocked by the speed and scale of the disaster, now seriously doubted that they could hold back the attacking tide. It is often said that Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was worth the cost in U.S. ships, planes, and men lost, because it galvanized the American people when they had seemed hopelessly divided over the coming war. The judgment is accurate, but incomplete. Hitler finished the job on Thursday, 4 days after the Japanese attack, by declaring war on the United States when he had the option of doing nothing at all. In secret pre-war communications with the British, Roosevelt had committed the United States to a Europe First strategy. The military logic of Europe First was unassailable, but the policy was never popular with the American people, who felt that they had a personal score to settle with the Japanese. On Sunday afternoon, Secretary of War Stimson had proposed a preemptive declaration of war against all three Axis partners, but Roosevelt had rejected the suggestion out of hand, saying he did not want to cleave American opinion at the very moment it had finally been incited to war. Even after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt could not have obtained a declaration of war against Germany except perhaps by a sharply divided vote in Congress. But without such a declaration, there was a danger that America's productive output would be sucked into the vortex of the Pacific emergency, leaving Russia and Britain on the verge of collapse. Pearl Harbor had caught Hitler by surprise, no less than anyone outside Japan's ruling circle. When the news reached the Wolf's Lair, the Führer's eastern headquarters in the Masurian woods of East Prussia, he was exultant. The turning point, he declared to members of his assembled staff. We now have an ally who has never been vanquished in 3,000 years. The surprise attack seemed likely to tie the United States down in the Pacific, and prevent for the time being its providing effective aid to Germany's enemies. The Japanese onslaught promised to deprive Britain of its Eastern Empire, perhaps even India. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels shared the Führer's misguided optimism, noting in his diary, a complete shift in the general world picture has taken place. The United States will scarcely now be in a position to transport worthwhile material to England, let alone the Soviet Union. On the morning of December 11, Benito Mussolini spoke from a balcony overlooking the Piazza Venezia in Rome, declaring to a rapturous throng that the powers of the Pact of Steel would prevail over the democracies. Hitler spoke before the Reichstag that afternoon at 3 p.m. The Führer's speech was typically strident and convoluted, a 90-minute performance laced with sarcasm, paranoia, invective, menace, and plaintive appeals to Germany's victimhood and good intentions. Paragraphs were expended in bile directed against the Soviet Union and Great Britain. He spoke at length on the Wehrmacht victories on the Eastern Front in the first 6 months of the Nazi-Soviet war, without admitting to the recent setbacks in the siege of Moscow. When he turned to the United States, Hitler fastened his wrath on the figure of Roosevelt as a member of the upper 10,000, a representative of the class whose path is smoothed in the democracies. This meddling gentleman, this honest warmonger, the man who is the main culprit of this war. The war, declared the Führer, had been arranged and provoked by a small circle of bankers and plutocrats, mostly American and Jewish, who had employed Roosevelt as their agent. Hitler congratulated Japan on having been the first to take the step of protest against his historically unique and shameless ill-treatment of truth, for the attack on Pearl Harbor had filled the German people, and I think, all other decent people in the world, with deep satisfaction. The declaration of war came in roundabout fashion, well over an hour after Hitler had taken the rostrum. I have therefore arranged for his passports to be handed to the American Chargé d'Affaires today, and the following, and at this point the expectant deputies drowned the Führer's words in applause. The American president and his plutocratic clique have mocked us as the have-nots. That is true, but the have-nots will see to it that they are not robbed of the little they have. The Axis powers, the Führer announced, had concluded an agreement which bound the three partners not to lay down their arms until they had subjugated and destroyed the Anglo-Saxon Jewish capitalist world. In Washington, the counter-declarations came quickly and without debate. The vote was unanimous in both houses of Congress. In signing the measures, Roosevelt said that the Allies were engaged in a single, integrated, global conflict across land and sea in every corner of the world. The forces endeavoring to enslave the entire world now are moving towards this hemisphere. The war would require a long, hard struggle against the forces of savagery and barbarism. The Axis propagandists had caricatured America as helplessly splintered by race, ethnicity, class, and creed, as a pampered, luxury-loving society in which the only cause that aroused the people was the pursuit of the almighty dollar, as a nation of loafers and malingerers, overpaid, overfed, and over-enfranchised, in which politicians went with hats in hand to receive the benediction of union bosses. To their eyes, the United States was a sprawling, individualistic, leisure-loving nation, strung out on jazz, movies, baseball, comic strips, horse racing, and radio comedies, anything but work, and certainly not the work of marching off to war. It was a nation enfeebled by divided government, with power impotently shared by the President and Congress and law courts, all constantly put upon by an insolent, unbridled press. Americans were a parochial, self-absorbed, inward-looking people, who could not care less about the rest of the world, who would never consent to spill a drop of blood to defend England, the villainous oppressor of their revolutionary heritage, or Russia, the nerve center of global communism, or any part of Asia, a place so distant and alien it could have been in another galaxy. The critique was shallow and disingenuous, a collage of crude stereotypes and half-truths. But even in America one heard self-criticism along similar lines, and the nation was clearly unprepared to confront the Axis in 1941. The American people did not like the naked aggression of Germany and Japan, and a majority favored Roosevelt's policy of providing munitions and material support to their victims. But entering the war was a very unpopular prospect. In a Gallup poll taken less than 2 months before Pearl Harbor, only 17% of Americans had favored war with Germany. By 1941, the president saw that war was coming but could do nothing more than he had already done to change the temper of the American people. He could only wait for some inciting incident or provocation. The turning point, Hitler had called the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. A complete shift in the general world picture, Goebbels had concluded. They were right, but not in the sense they intended. Before December 7, 1941, the American industrial economy, lying completely beyond the reach of Axis bombers or armies, had been the single best hope of the embattled Allies. Only by militarizing that economy, harnessing it entirely to war production, could the power of the Axis be destroyed. But the sprawling republic would never be mobilized or militarized without the consent of the American people. There was just one thing that they could do to get Roosevelt completely off the horns of the dilemma, wrote the presidential speechwriter Bob Sherwood. And that is precisely what they did, at one stroke, in a manner so challenging, so insulting and enraging, that the divided and confused American people were instantly rendered unanimous and certain. If the Second World War could be said to have pivoted on a single point, it was not the Battle of Britain, or El Alamein, or Stalingrad, or the fall of Italy. Pearl Harbor, by giving Roosevelt the license to do what needed to be done, sealed the fate of both Germany and Japan.